Hey everybody, welcome to week number 3. Welcome to chapter number 3. At the end of this week on Friday, we will have reached the midpoint of our asynchronous study. Congratulations, you're almost halfway there. I hope you are enjoying yourself. This has just been so much fun for me, a totally new format for me, so awesome. Thanks for taking a chance on me. Thanks for taking a chance on this format. I hope you are having fun settling into the cadence and the rhythm. And I think there's just been really terrific participation on the discussion prompts. So thank you so much. Those emails that are flying back and forth in our inboxes. Gosh, every time I see one show up, I'm just so excited to dive in. So keep that practice up. Reply to previous weeks. If you missed one, you want to go back in time, go ahead. I think I have everybody, just about everybody enrolled in the Google group at this point. If you're having troubles with that, then let me know and I can do my best to troubleshoot. But hopefully you've got that figured out and you're feeling good about the way the study is going. Did you celebrate Purim last week? Did you have an extra glass of wine for Esther and Mordecai last week? Did you wear any costumes? Did you read the book of Esther? That would have been a cool thing to do. So here we're going into week 3. This week we're going to look at some important parables from Jesus. We're looking at Jesus's teachings. So do pay attention to the Great Commission, to a discussion about taxes, to kind of unpacking the story of the widow's mite. Really great chapter this week because we're tapping into yet more ideas that we probably already had some preconceived notions on the front end, and maybe we're going to have some of those preconceived notions confronted by Professor Levine this week. What I wanted to do in this Monday video is just to spend a couple of minutes taking one of the themes from last week, kind of segueing that into this week. I want to expand a little bit. I thought it was cool to talk about Purim last week. And I think because you're getting such good content in Professor Levine's book, you don't necessarily need me to spoon feed you Professor Levine's content. She does it way better than I ever could. But one thing that I think we can do is to continue to sort of lift up Jewish practice and ritual. I think given the nature of the study that I've been engaged in for the past couple of decades, I've picked up some things that may be interesting tidbits to you. So I'm going to give you some more of those today. So let me make the segue for us. Last week on Friday, I sent around the Friday scriptures. Also, by the way, last week, I tried to make that a little bit more of an accessible and helpful document. So I linked out to where the resources to commentary are in case you wanted to check those resources out. Another thing that I did is I highlighted in the commentary some things that I thought were especially interesting. And a third thing, which is kind of the most substantial difference, I put a sort of a top page on that with a one-page summary of what I think are the things that we should be paying attention to. Now, I've not been to seminary. I'm not credentialed. I am merely a lay leader in my local congregation. So don't take anything that I say too seriously. But, I've done a lot of study, a fair amount of it at any rate. So I tried to give you just a summary of the sacred scriptures, just a kind of a roadmap. And I would like you to spend time with those through the weekend or really whenever you're able to. That's a PDF. You can print that document. Just look at it on your laptop or desktop. But I think reading through those just orients us right in the primary material. So it isn't only what the scholars said, it's not only what Professor Levine said, but it's also about here's what the text actually says. So at any rate, in Friday's scriptures, if you did read those or when you read those, you'll notice maybe something curious. I said that Jesus is putting a fence around the Torah. So you're going to encounter that in a much more substantive way. In chapter 3, Professor Levine is going to talk to you some about putting a fence around Torah. Now, what that looks like for Jesus is in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a really familiar construction. Jesus says, well, you heard it said that, ... but truly I tell you, ... When Jesus is doing that, he is not nullifying or abolishing what the law says. He is intensifying what the law says. That is called putting a fence around Torah. The rabbis do it. In fact, in the Mishnaic writings, there was a Mishnah. There's a Talmud, and then there's the later Mishnah. You don't need to know what these terms are necessarily, unless you're interested. And then hit me up individually. I'd love to talk about this over coffee or over a Zoom. But these are interpretations of the written law. So the first 5 books of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah, all many different names for the same thing. This is the written law. But the way to interpret the written law was called the oral law. The oral law was written down, oddly enough. It was oral for a long, long time. But the Talmud, there was a Babylonian Talmud that was finished during the Babylonian exile, when Jews were in diaspora. They needed to figure out a way, separated from a temple, how are we going to live this stuff out? So the written law, the interpretation of the written law was the oral law that began to be collected in things like the Talmud, later the Mishnah. These are all rabbinic writings, interpretations of the law. It was really common rabbinic practice. It was common practice to put a fence around the Torah. Now, what that means is to take kind of the core law, but then to put some additional kind of protections around it, so that you didn't need to tiptoe right up to the law to wonder if you're breaking it or not. But instead, like you put a fence around a pool to keep little kids out, you need to have some protections to make sure that you don't violate the law. So that's putting a fence around Torah. You're going to read about that in chapter 3. Professor Levine does tie it to the Sermon on the Mount. But let me give you, this is a live thing that really happens. And so let me give you an example. And a good thing to point to here is kosher dietary guidelines, or kashrut. So kashrut, or kosher dietary guidelines, are described in the Torah. There are some really specific edicts that are given. One of them is this: do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So this is talking about, for example, a goat calf, a goat kid, and then the mother from which milk can be derived. You would not boil the child in the mother's milk. That was prohibited. That was off limits. You do not do that. So that is the written law. But to put a fence around that law, the rabbi said, we need to separate all milk and all meat. So you do not have a meal with milk and meat together. And in fact, kosher includes the laws for how you can do that. You're allowed to have dairy first and then have a meat course later, but it has to be a certain amount of time. There's a lot of rules around what you're supposed to do. Fence around the Torah. You separate your milk from your meat. So a cheeseburger is not kosher, even if it is kosher meat. If it was meat that was supervised, the slaughter and processing of the meat was supervised by a rabbi. That's part of the kosher requirement for meat to be kosher. Even if it is kosher meat, you're not allowed to have a cheeseburger, because that is putting dairy and meat together. So the written law says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. The fence around that law, the fence around Torah, is you've got to separate all milk from all meat. Now, this indeed is something that happens. So let me tell you, in the modern context, so we have Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers and Boca and Gardein and all these different products, right, that are sort of meat, imitation meat substitutes and things like that. So those of us who choose not to eat meat for a number of reasons, whether it's economic, environmental, because we want to ameliorate suffering in the world, many different reasons to be vegetarian or vegan. But maybe you want to have a vegan cheeseburger. Maybe it's vegan meat and vegan cheese, so you are not violating the law. But imagine if you are someone who keeps kosher and another Jewish person is around and sees you eating a cheeseburger, then they may think, well, I know Adam keeps kosher and he's eating that cheeseburger, so it must be okay, so then I'm going to have a cheeseburger. Well, to put a fence around that law, a further intensification of the law, that if you were to get an Impossible Whopper from Burger King, you may keep the wrapper on the table beside you while you're eating, so that if anybody looked over and they're like, oh, there's Adam, he keeps kosher, he's eating that thing, they'd see, oh, look right next to him, there's the Impossible Whopper wrapper, so people would know that it's a veggie burger, so I'm not violating that law. So that is how you put a fence around Torah. So I want to just share that with you because that's really cool. I think that's a really thoughtful practice to say, listen, we take this code so seriously, not only kashrut, but we take the mitzvot, the commandments, the laws, and Torah, we take them so seriously that we want to put a fence around those laws to make sure that we do not violate them. So that's the segue from last week that comes in here to week 3, to chapter 3 about putting a fence around Torah, a really cool contemporary Jewish practice that was still present with Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. So yet further evidence to show us just how thoroughly Jewish Jesus was, both in belief and in practice. So, hey, we're learning a lot together. We're reaching the midway point of our study. I hope you're enjoying yourselves. I hope you are letting Lent do its work, as Professor Levine encouraged us to do. Make sure you participate in the discussion on Wednesday, more scriptures on Friday, when we will actually be at the midpoint of the study. All right, friends, thanks so much. Looking forward to being with you again, and talk soon. Peace.